And we are back in the room, and we are delighted very much to welcome Ian Henderson, forensic computing expert, witness, fraud investigator, and e-disclosure specialist to the MSS West Midlands. Lovely to have you on. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. No, first time in this building, so first time meeting MSS, so it's a pleasure.
Wonderful. And what an iconic building, the Wesleyan building. I've never been in, but I'm really grateful to be here. We've looked at ways to improve the third-party end customer security relationship. And in this session, I wanted to explore your expertise, which is forensics. And I wanted to maybe move the conversation towards whether or not forensics as a service is feasible at scale, or whether it will very much require that individual touch. Maybe as a starter for 10, can you tell us what forensics really encompasses?
Well, forensics as a word, it sort of encompasses the interface between technology and the law. Most of my sort of time is spent in court giving evidence as an expert witness. And I don't think that's going to change. The legal system still requires live evidence, witnesses to be sort of cross-examined and so on. In terms of the wider issue, forensics as a service, I think is increasingly the direction of travel. For a number of reasons. It's more efficient, perhaps, to provide it as a service rather than lots of individual sort of practitioners. Forensics tends to be quite an expensive area to operate, whether it's software licenses, whether it's hardware, whether it's access to other services that are sort of closely associated. So there's a lot of benefits in providing that service at scale through a centralized service sort of provider, and that seems to be very much the direction of travel.
Okay, well, that paints a great picture, and I can see very much how that would fit in with the MSS. But let's explore, because it's a bit more informal fireside chat. Let's explore a little bit about yourself. I've seen your very impressive resume, of course, but what can you tell us to give a flavor of the things that you've worked on in this field?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm allowed to show a book that was published last week.
Please.
The Great Post Office Scandal, greatest miscarriage of justice in English legal history. It's something I've worked on for about sort of 9 years. It's a horrible example of IT going wrong and having devastating consequences, not only for individuals, but ultimately to taxpayers. Compensation that's being sort of discussed at the moment is likely to be in the order of about £1,000 million.
Wow.
The IT system that went wrong was the largest non-military IT system in Europe. And business schools, if they're sensible, if they approach this in the right way, will be looking at this as a case study for, probably the next 10 years. Because there's so many lessons to be gained from looking at it, understanding what the problems were and how we got into the mess that we got into. And the book by Nick Wallace is a great introduction to that. It's also a very good read. I think it ought to be recommended, if not compulsory reading, for anybody working in IT, because it highlights the gap between management, who didn't really understand IT, and the technology providers, who arguably didn't communicate well with management, and that gap was where things started going wrong. So that's a case that I've worked on for about 9 years. More recently, or most recently, I was in the High Court giving evidence as an expert witness. A case that certainly got a lot of tabloid attention was Rebecca Vardy-Colleen Rooney, where I was the IT expert acting on behalf of the legal team for Rebecca Vardy. Most of my work is civil litigation, but I've also recently done a number of appeals in the Court of Appeal in terms of criminal convictions brought by Post Office. And as you're probably aware, we've had something approaching 70 convictions overturned in the Court of Appeal. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's likely to be hundreds more.
And yes, it is a very sorry affair, and I think now it's out in the open. It's good that we can read about it and speak about it. But on a business level, and in fact, Ian in the audience says, isn't forensics as a service mainly a time-saving tool? I suppose for the uninitiated, I can obviously see it, but for the uninitiated, why should forensics be in their arsenal of services or things that they need to do?
Well, it's not necessarily something you need to do. It's certainly something you need to consider. Forensics is drilling into the sort of the detail that is often invisible to a typical sort of user. I mean, I started off many years ago getting involved often with employer disputes over documents that were being challenged, emails where authenticity was in dispute, and so on. The problem is that nothing is necessarily what it seems at face value, and you often need to dig into the forensic level of detail in terms of log files, attribution, metadata, and so on, in order to challenge assumptions or allegations that have been made. So it's not something that you would necessarily do every day, but when something is in dispute, forensics is often the way to deal with that dispute.
And would that be increasingly useful in the area of insurance? We've read about insurers saying, can I have my payout back because I think this was a nation state actor? Is it even useful in that area?
Very much so. In fact, before getting into forensics, I was head of investigations at Lloyd's of London, or London insurance sort of market. And we were increasingly using a forensic approach in order to investigate claims, in order to challenge evidence that was being provided to us. And surprise, surprise, not every claimant was quite as honest as they perhaps were trying to present their particular position.
And to the extent where a layperson, myself included, generalist, could understand, what are the particular signs that something may not be as it should be? Maybe in the nation state actor sort of area, maybe in false claims, something to give a flavor of your work.
Well, perhaps a fairly typical example is in litigation. Lawyers tend to rely on sort of paper documents. And my advice almost inevitably is don't rely just on a paper document. A printed out email can be manipulated very easily. And I've been involved in sort of cases where the authenticity of a particular email or Word document or something like that has been at issue. And we often find that the hidden data, the metadata, the electronic copy of that email tells a very different story from the piece of paper that was produced by one party in litigation.
And so that seems really, really key, because before we talked about phishing and then looking under the hood at who's phishing you and why. Do you think then that this could be eventually, and I'm not saying it is, but could it eventually be done as an automated service, or will it always have a flair of the investigator?
Well, the end product often is going to involve litigation. I don't see the courts sort of fundamentally changing their approach. A principle of the English legal system is direct witness testimony from a live person. But in terms of getting to that point, I mean, already automation is being used to filter and find relevant material. One of the problems that has developed over the last 5-10 years has been the huge increase in the amount of data that is available, whether it's the web, whether it's email, whether it's electronic documents, sort of generally. I mean, a medium-sized company, when it's kicking off an investigation, I mean, often has to consider, hundreds, if not thousands, of endpoints or employees, terabytes of data. Handling or dealing with that manually is just not practical. So you've got to adopt a triage approach. You've got to use technology in order to find the needle in the haystack. And then once you've narrowed down that search to a more manageable number of documents or issues, that's then the point that the forensic specialist perhaps gets directly involved.
So that is encouraging, because many managed service providers, managed security service providers are approached by solution providers saying that they can find that needle. Are we saying that technology exists to get it that far, but then it will be for you or someone with your equivalent skill set to sort of take it forward?
Yeah, I think that's a good description. You use technology to filter and find the needles in the haystack, the many needles which need often to be manually reviewed and assessed and investigated from the point of view of forensic level evidence, and that ultimately is always going to be done by a forensic specialist. The sort of skill set that is needed is too variable to be sort of truly automated, but giving them a manageable amount of data to look at, is something that does make sense from an automation perspective.
And so conversely, what are your thoughts, and I don't really want to load it, but what are your thoughts on some of the solution providers that say, give me access to this port and that port, and I will be able to vet everything, and I have a full paper trail, and I'll use AI and this and this. I don't want to load the question, but
well, I'm very suspicious of anybody who promotes AI. It's a buzzword that seems to pop up in almost every conversation with a solution sort of provider sort of these days. What I would say is that many solution providers overpromise and underdeliver. And if I look back at cases that I've got involved with, a very good sort of salesman has persuaded an organization to take on a particular product, and surprise, surprise, it doesn't actually deliver the goods in the way that it was sold or described. So I think a degree of healthy skepticism. I'm particularly skeptical about solution providers who say, we'll suck all the data in and we'll find the fraud. The automated sort of policeman who tramples around in a pile of sort of data and finds the one smoking gun, that isn't happening. And I'd be very suspicious of any solution provider who claim to be able to do that.
Yes, I think the community will probably agree with you in those respects, reflecting on other conversations that we've had. So with that, I'm just thinking off the cuff here. Could forensics be used to properly assess a SaaS platform that has claims, or is that not really a good use case?
I think you'd have to look at the data sort of volumes and the number of items that would be in sort of focus. It's certainly got potential and an application in that scenario. But again, the main sort of difference is that forensics is very much an individual hands-on approach to looking at that hidden sort of data. That doesn't lend itself to automation to any great extent. So the secret is actually identifying the sort of the tip of the iceberg, or the much smaller amount of data that is potentially relevant, rather than looking at the complete universe of information.
Okay, which is why you're not so much a fan of I'll hoover the data and then tell you what's happening. Tom asked an interesting one. How can we do forensics as a service effectively now that so many have gone to the cloud? Who is going to let us see their API?
Well, the cloud is a challenge. Fortunately, new tools are sort of coming on stream that make that processing much easier. At the end of the day, the key evidence is probably going to have to come out of the cloud and onto the sort of the desktop. So regard the cloud as a depository or repository of data, but recognize that at some point you're going to have to extract the, what you think is relevant or the most relevant items and deal with that on the desktop. And that's probably in principle not much different from the previous approach where we had big metal storage devices in-house and so on. It's just that they've now moved away from an in-house solution to a cloud solution.
Okay, and then I mean, maybe specifically, and Tom says interesting, thank you, but do we specifically need the cloud API? Is it really necessary? Because some people have said they've developed CDR, cloud detection response, but I can't see some of the big cloud providers letting you have a look.
No, my sort of personal view is I'm interested in the data, not necessarily the sort of the programming sort of interface. And whilst I could see that some semi-automated solutions may well require sort of API level sort of access, if you've got access to the data, I would be focusing on the data rather than the API.
Very good. Well, Tom asked a question, or Ian asked a question, and then Edem, but I'll go with Edem and then backwards. It isn't forensic data acquisition and data analysis just what you need to conduct a triage or incident investigation?
Well, it certainly forms part of it. Triage is how you narrow that field down. It's perhaps the first step in the needle in the haystack, and it's obviously not practical or efficient or cost effective to apply a forensic approach to all of the data. You've got to filter it in some way, and a sort of a triage approach is a good way of doing that.
Okay, thanks, Adam. And then going back, Ian asked previously, do you then think it's difficult to pivot to mobile forensics?
Well, mobile forensics is a very specialized area. You need to differentiate between the acquisition stage and the analysis stage. As a result of fairly recent legislation, the acquisition phase, where a mobile device needs to go to a lab that is accredited, ISO 27001 and so on. And I will deal with the analysis of the data. I won't actually deal with the acquisition itself. I will use an accredited lab, because if you're going to rely on that evidence and survive any challenge in court, it needs to be produced by an accredited lab.
Okay, an accredited lab, which could be connected as a service maybe to an MSS?
Yes, very much so. And that seems to be the pattern that is developing at the moment.
Okay, and then building on Adam's question of forensic data acquisition and maybe connected to our question of the cloud, what do you think of acquiring forensic data remotely at scale?
It's beginning to happen. It's not necessarily the most efficient way to process that data, but with good bandwidths, with good technology, it is possible, and there's some quite exciting developments in that area. Okay.
And Adam, I'd be interested to find out more about why, what you're looking at, because I know Adam works in the world of MSS. And Tom says, have you found it any times when fragmented data became subjective?
Fragmented data is often potentially very relevant, and I'll give you an example. If I'm looking at a laptop sort of computer, there's going to be the live data on that computer, the emails, the office documents, and so on. But there may well be fragments of deleted documents there that may actually potentially be the smoking gun. Most forensic examiners will not look at that data at a first pass. They'll deal with the more readily visible or available sort of data. But depending on the particular circumstances of the case, they may well get asked to do a deep dive into fragments of data that exist still on the hard drive, but no longer as some entire files or documents.
No, that's and that is an interesting angle, isn't it? I've never really considered fragmented data and versus non-fragmented.
Yes, and where it gets even more exciting or challenging is the cloud. I mean, generally speaking, fragmented data doesn't really exist in the cloud because of the way that the cloud API actually sort of operates. And I don't know of any forensic practitioners that will tackle the same sort of concept of fragmented data in the cloud. It's more of a concept that applies at sort of desktop or enterprise sort of level rather than in the cloud.
Okay, I like that. So now, conscious that we're going to segue into a panel about skill sets. I haven't gone into the skill sets and how to acquire that yet, but we can do that in the engineer panel. But in a sort of room 101 question, should we have on-hand forensics as a service as a staple for the MSS?
Well, what I usually say is identify your solution providers well before you're actually going to sort of need them. Have those emergency contact numbers at hand. So, on a Friday afternoon where you're having a bad day and you need to reach out to a specialist provider, you know who you're going to contact, how you're going to contact, and plan that in advance. That preparation is actually the key to successful sort of deployment of forensic skill set.
Okay, preparation. Much as you need to know who to call before a ransomware attack, you need to know who to call before fire and all sorts. I think that's a great sentiment when we put forensics into our bag. But good, let's then leave it there, because I'm conscious we're going to get into the skill set question, and I'll bring our fellow panelists up to the table. But Ian, this is fantastic. Thank you very much for doing a deep dive on forensics, and of course your very, very interesting career is undoubtedly a great boost to our West Midlands forum today.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will see you in the audience. Thanks, Ian. And we'll be back shortly with our full panel.